So I'm John Cook. I am a research fellow at the Climate Change Communication Research Hub at Monash University. I started there a week ago, and previously I was at George Mason University working with the Centre for Climate Change Communication. Throughout my career, I've spent the last decade or more researching basically how to counter climate misinformation. And over the last decade, my research has increasingly focused on critical thinking and finding that that approach of using critical thinking to address misinformation applies across the board, not just climate change, but health misinformation, COVID-19 over the last year, as well as vaccination currently, as well as other issues like evolution, flat earthism even, and conspiracy theories. So I guess the first question is, why is it important for journalists to be fact-based and objective when reporting about misinformation? And I guess especially when fact-checking misinformation, whether they're debunking some misinformation that's out there or doing a fact check of some sort. And the really important thing to realize in this kind of situation when dealing with misinformation is it's actually a really complicated psychological thing that's going on. When you're fact-checking, you're actually correcting misperceptions and you're making changes to people's mental models. And there's a lot going on under the hood psychologically when you do that kind of thing. And so there's been decades of psychological research into debunking and the psychology of misinformation that has found that there are many ways for it to go wrong. There's many kind of psychological booby traps. Over decades, researchers have been building a catalogue of essentially best practice recommendations on how to most effectively deal with misinformation. So I think it's really important that journalists or really educators, scientists, anyone who's engaging with the public about misinformation are aware to some degree of what are the best practices on how to address misinformation. And I don't expect journalists or anyone really to have to dig in and read all the literature. That's why we wrote the debunking handbook. We just summarize it all in a very short, concise, practical guide. Here's what the research says, and here are the most effective ways to debunk misinformation.
John, thanks for that. Would you like to talk about some of the most key points that you identified in the handbook as being essential?
Yeah, I guess I would say it's probably two main sort of tips that I would give. There's a lot of pages, but really it boils down to the two most important things when correcting misinformation. And the first, which I call the golden rule of debunking, is fight sticky myths with stickier facts. The challenge of misinformation is it's sticky. It grabs people's attention and it sticks in the memory, and misinformation is more viral than accurate information. Studies have shown that it's more likely to be shared on social media. And so that's a challenge for any of us working in the fact-based world where we're trying to communicate facts, and the world is complicated. Facts are complicated and nuanced and hard to explain. And often the myths are simple. They grab people's emotions. They are often, quite, shocking or extreme. And it's kind of an unequal playing field. We're kind of constrained by reality, whereas misinformation can say and do anything to get people's attention. And so the golden rule, fight sticky myths with stickier facts, basically means that we, as communicators, as journalists, scientists, educators, we need to put a lot of effort and thought into how do we communicate the facts in a way that is as sticky as possible. And by sticky, I mean It needs to be as simple as possible. It needs to be engaging, credible, concrete. Ideally, you communicate your facts in the form of a story. And probably simplicity is the most important thing. And by that, I don't mean oversimplify. I mean boil down your facts and your science to the key core fact. What's the key thing that you're looking to communicate, and make sure that you're clear, you understand what is that core fact, and put the strongest emphasis on that. You can add a lot of flesh around that skeleton, but make sure you identified your skeleton and communicate that clearly.
So that might be a fact that you could even call out in a box or some other, if that's your main point, you might find some ways to highlight it. And major point number 2?
Yeah, so, okay, what I've already said, create and communicate sticky facts. That is a lot. That is hard work, and you can't underestimate just how challenging that is. But even if you achieve that, you've only really done half the job. Communicating sticky facts is necessary but insufficient. The second thing that you need to do is explain how the myth distorts the facts. Misinformation typically uses either logical fallacies or rhetorical techniques to distort the facts and the science. And when studies have shown that when people are presented with the facts and the myth, but they have no way of resolving the conflict, telling which is true and which is false, they cancel each other out. And so that's really dangerous. If people can't resolve the conflict and tell how the myth distorts the facts, then we can do all our sticky facts communication and hone it and refine our analogies and the way our wording and get it perfect. And then a myth can come along and just cancel out all our good work. So we also need to explain, here is the rhetorical techniques or the fallacies that the misinformation uses to distort the facts. So those are the two elements of debunking. Explain the facts and explain how the myth distorts the facts.
Fabulous, thank you. You want to go on to the next question?
Give an example of when journalists have done this right. So I guess I haven't really talked about that. So thinking of examples, most of the examples of journalists responding to misinformation, what comes to mind mostly is bad examples. Like fact checking tends to put the emphasis on the myth rather than the fact. Usually you'll just see the headline as the myth, and then underneath will be a long detailed debunking. And that's problematic because it's putting the emphasis on the myth rather than the facts. And often all people see and remember is the headline. When a fact check is posted on like social media, often that's all that's shown is the headline, and people don't even click the link, and all they'll be given is the misinformation.
Can you give an example of, I know you have irritatingly hundreds, I'm sure, of where there was misinformation around climate change in particular, and what kinds of effects that has?
Yeah, so I mean, I can just off the top of my head, there's been a couple of examples of misinformation about climate change just in the last week. And they often come from leading politicians. There was a video just a day or two ago from Marjorie Green arguing that that global warming was caused by natural causes rather than human activity because there was climate change during ice ages in the past. So she was basically making the argument that climate has changed naturally in the past, so what's happening now must be natural, which is a logically false argument, and it's being debunked like for decades, but the myth persists, and it continues to be used by climate deniers. And it's especially problematic when it comes from politicians, because the biggest influencer of public changes in public opinion about climate change is what our political leaders are saying. So when our politicians are one of the sources of misinformation, that has a quite corrosive effect on public perceptions. Another recent one just over the last week was another politician, Ron Johnson, arguing that to the New York Times that Greenland used to be green, Greenland was green, and therefore, because it's in the title, right? It's called Greenland. So therefore, it's actually the same argument as what Marjorie Greene was saying. Climate has changed before, Greenland was green and now it's icy, and therefore climate must be changing due to natural causes rather than human activity. And that argument is wrong on several levels. Firstly, the Greenland ice sheet has been there for over 800,000 years, because we have ice cores going back 800,000 years, showing us climate in Greenland. And so Greenland wasn't green during medieval times. That was basically just good marketing from the person who gave it that title in order to coax people to move there. But again, the argument is also logically false. The challenge is logical fallacies can be persuasive, because critical thinking isn't really a thing that's taught much in classrooms. And so often arguments can be superficially convincing, even though they're actually quite false. So that's why journalists and educators explaining these rhetorical techniques in misinformation is important. That builds public resilience, so they're less likely to be misled.
Are there any particular red flags for misinformation that you would encourage journalists to look out for?
A framework that I found really useful for flagging misinformation is the 5 techniques of science denial, summarized with the acronym FLICC, F-L-I-C-C. Fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. And what I've been doing is developing tools, resources, and even a critical thinking game that teaches FLICC to people so that they can see these red flags in any information they come across. And so building our awareness of FLICC and the techniques of science denial is a really useful way to be able to spot misinformation and then either call it out, or at the very least, not go on to share it.
Thank you, John. All right. Want to go on to the last couple questions?
The last question, do I have a special message for journalists from the Caribbean? If I had one message for journalists in the Caribbean, it would be the importance of helping the public join the dots between climate change and extreme weather, such as hurricanes and flooding, and sea level, which is the links are even clearer between climate change and sea level rise. It's important when we talk about extreme weather to make sure that we don't inadvertently mislead the public as well. The way scientists talk about extreme weather, from a scientific point of view, in relation to climate change, it's problematic to say this event was caused by climate change. However, what we can say is that climate change influences all weather events. And as the climate is changing, it's making hurricanes more intense, it's making flooding events more likely. It's just intensifying the water cycle in general. And so while it's hard to really give definitive answers about a single event, what we do know is that events are becoming more likely and more likely to be more intense. And so helping people join the dots so that when they are hit with weather events, and understanding that this kind of intense event is more likely to happen now, or it's going to be more intense because of climate change, helps them put it into a proper perspective. So I guess my main advice is help join the dots between climate change and weather events, but in a way that's consistent with the science.
It's wonderful, John. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to you.